Anatol, we are starting with some domestic slash very international issues that emanated from here in the United States. And then we will talk more about Ukraine. We are all overwhelmed and concerned about the leaks that we learned about last week. And right now, there is more unknown than known facts about what happened. But in your opinion, in your assessment, what are the main things we learned from and about those leaks of Ukrainian related documents so far?
Well, for me personally, the most important thing I learned was that Ukrainian anti-aircraft missiles are running out, because I spent a week in hospital in Zaporizhia last month in Ukraine, and I was struck by the ineffectiveness of the Russian air campaign. But of course, that was due not only to the inaccuracy of the Russian missiles, but also to the great effectiveness of Ukrainian anti-missile fire. If the Ukrainians are indeed running out of anti-aircraft missiles and anti-missile missiles, that could make a big difference to the war, both in terms of Russia's ability to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, but also, of course, to the fighting on the ground, if Russia is able to, for the first time since the beginning of the war, deploy its ground attack aircraft and helicopters, because the failure of the Russian Air Force to support its ground forces has been one of the most striking things about this war, and one of the most striking failures of the Russian side, because military analysts assumed before the war that this was going to play a critical role. But the Ukrainians shot down so many of these planes. There also seems to have been just problems with coordination and with friendly fire. But undoubtedly, the fact that the Russians simply suffered so many casualties in their air force did, for really the whole of the following year, knock the stuffing out of them as far as ground attack aircraft were concerned. If they are able to use them again, that could make a big difference. And that, of course, would also reinforce the rather pessimistic assessment in the leaked documents about the chances of Ukraine's counteroffensive, which is planned and forthcoming, succeeding. Now, that is not entirely new. We have heard such suggestions before from the US military, but obviously the fact that this is an internal document and backed up with great detail does make it striking. Of course, though, the documents covered a great deal of ground, and there are a number of other striking things. Obviously, that the US continues to spy on close allies, despite assurances that it would not do so. And in the Middle East, the fact that the Egyptian regime was seriously considering selling missiles to Russia. Now, the Biden administration seems to have been able to stop that, but obviously that has attracted some very harsh criticism in the United States.
Anatol, when we're talking about the breaking news, or what sounded like breaking news, and the concerns of the United States spying on its allies, I'm just wondering what your opinion is about this whole uproar, because it seems like secret services and intelligence just, exist by definition for these purposes. And, even friendly countries kind of survey and spy on each other. Why was it such a big element of a scandal here?
Well, because in 2012, 2013, as a result of the original WikiLeaks, it became known that the United States, the NSA, was spying on the private communications of European leaders, including Angela Merkel. And I think that though you're absolutely right, of course, that spying even on friendly countries is completely par for the course for intelligence services, I think it was widely felt that this was going a bit far. And the fact that the United States used the Danish intelligence services as a base for this, of course, also created some serious tensions within Europe. And so, I mean, I don't. This is not going to lead to a serious breach, just as the revelations 10 years ago did not lead to a serious breach. It will die down again, but it's certainly something of an embarrassment.
Anatol, you mentioned that you were just in Ukraine, unfortunately injured in the process of the trip, and I wanted, and thankfully you are back now in a safe environment and talking to us. I wanted to ask about your experience there in terms of what you saw, what you heard from people, and how this, you already mentioned the upcoming imminent offensive. How does it feel, the preparation on the ground, what's going on, basically your eyewitness experience of what is happening there now?
Well, first of all, I should say that my injury had nothing to do with the war. I just fell over. I could have done it in the comfort of my own home. But yes, it did lead to me spending an interesting week in Zaporizhia under Russian fire, which, as I said, was actually surprisingly ineffective. As to the general impression, well, I was there for 3 weeks, so I got a huge number of different impressions. As to the forthcoming offensive, I couldn't really say because I was not allowed to go to the front line, so I couldn't form an assessment of that. Ukrainian morale remains extremely high. There is a very strong commitment to continue the war. Although there are certain regional differences there. The further you move to the south, at least, the more concerned people are about the renewal of major fighting in their area. One of the reasons is that, of course, a lot of people still have relatives who remain under Russian occupation. And as one woman said to me, she wants the liberation of the lands occupied by Russia, but she's afraid what will happen to her grandmother in the city of Melitopol if there is a battle in Melitopol like the battle in Mariupol last year that leads to the destruction of the city. So there is certainly a large majority of Ukrainians, and I would say all Ukrainians in public, support the recovery of all Ukraine's lost territory, including Crimea and the eastern Donbass, which has been occupied by Russia or backed by Russia since 2014. In private, however, there is a quite large minority which thinks that in the end Ukraine will have to compromise on that it's not possible for Ukraine to recover those territories, and that the attempt to do so will mean that the war goes on forever. I have to say, though, that these people, without exception, were not willing to speak on the record. In public, a rather, a mood of unanimity has been created, but partly, obviously, because of very understandable public rage and anger with the Russian invasion and desire to punish Russia, but also undoubtedly open public debate on this issue is not encouraged.
Anatol, you wrote an op-ed about Crimea and options for Crimea, and you analyzed some statements of the Ukrainian officials in that regard. Could you unpack a little bit for us the public rhetoric that we're hearing from Ukraine regarding Crimea, and whether the latest events with the leaked documents and how the offensive is going to be unfolding is going to affect that?
Ukrainian official rhetoric has changed in the course of the war. Initially, you may remember that President Zelensky proposed a peace settlement in which Russia would retain, at least provisionally, control of Crimea and the eastern Donbass in return for withdrawing from all the other territory it had occupied. He didn't say that Ukraine would give up Crimea and the eastern Donbass, but he said that it could be left for future negotiation, which suggested that in the end Russia might de facto continue to control these areas. Now, more recently, in recent months, the line of the Ukrainian government has been that the return of all these territories is non-negotiable, even as part of a temporary ceasefire, and that Ukraine must insist on their complete and unconditional return. But recently you have had some statements by certain Ukrainian officials suggesting that if the Ukrainian counteroffensive gets as far as the border of Crimea, the Ukrainians might be willing to talk to the Russians about at least a provisional settlement. That, however, continues to be completely contradicted by other Ukrainian officials who stick to the existing line that all the territory must be returned. And certainly among the military veterans I talked to, there was unanimity that Ukraine must fight on for the recovery of all its lost territory. So there are, obvious divisions in the Ukrainian government. We don't know what President Zelensky himself thinks, but of course, given that he spent the past 8 months talking about the non-negotiable return of Crimea and the Eastern Donbass, one can see that it would be quite difficult for him to change, his public language now, unless, of course, he basically came under intense pressure from the United States to do so.
Anatol, it's interesting that the American rhetoric on that has been changing gradually as well, or maybe not gradually and consistently, but we heard different statements about how Ukraine should decide what lands to recover and how far the support should go, at least not necessarily in the official statements, but in the analysis surrounding this situation. And I'm just wondering, do you feel that the latest incident with leaked documents is going to amend the position and the assistance of the European allies and United States with regards to how the offensive is going to unfold and how the whole grand plan for continuation of this war is made?
Well, the critical question is, of course, what happens on the battlefield. If Ukraine breaks through to the Sea of Azov, then I think, well, actually, in all the scenarios, I think you're likely to see more Western pressure for a ceasefire, because if Ukraine breaks through to the Sea of Azov, there will be a feeling that Ukraine has now recovered enough. And of course, there is real fear that if Ukraine threatens to take back Crimea, that Putin would escalate radically, possibly even towards nuclear war. If the Ukrainian counteroffensive fails, then there will be equally a growth of the feeling already expressed in these leaked documents that the Ukrainian armed forces are not really up to defeating the Russians, and there should be a ceasefire. And of course, if you get a continuation of the existing stalemate, well, likewise, I mean, the question will be, how long should this bloody stalemate continue before there is a recognition? Of course, it has to be on both sides. I mean, Russia also needs to accept a ceasefire. Of course, the question will be if Ukraine, well, if the Ukrainian counteroffensive succeeds, there will be many people in Ukraine who will say, no, we must reject Western pressure, and we must go on to reconquer Crimea and the Eastern Donbass. And then, of course, the question will be, will the West be prepared to bring pressure to bear on Ukraine to stop? If, on the other hand, Ukraine suffers defeat, there will undoubtedly be voices in the West who say, now we must do much more to support Ukraine. We must give many more weapons. We must even consider, perhaps sending in Western troops but in the end, we will just have to see how the Ukrainian counteroffensive goes. And we must remember, of course, that US intelligence assessments have not always been accurate. I mean, sometimes they have with regard to predicting the Russian invasion, but of course the vast majority of US military analysts predicted an easy Russian victory. So they were wrong about that. They could be, wrong about Ukrainian weaknesses today. Personally, I'm not making any firm predictions because we've been surprised so often in the past.
Anatol, one more question. It's more about the Russian preparations and preparedness, maybe. We just learned that it's been legally kind of fortified, the possibility of sending electronic notifications of people to get mobilized. And it's a huge discussion now in Russia that the second wave of mobilization is going to be underway soon. How are you seeing that? And is the Russian leadership actually preparing in your mind for another mobilization? And can they actually afford that?
It seems that they are, or at the very least, that they want to send a strong signal to the West that they are. Because, as also emerges from these leaks, though we knew it already, the Russians have suffered huge casualties, especially among their elite troops. They need more men. And it's long been clear that Putin and the Russian government are preparing for a very long war in which they will need to call up, all available Russian reserves. The question, of course, is how much of a backlash this will cause in Russian society. It is naturally extremely unpopular among a lot of younger Russians. On the other hand, the grip now of the Russian government on political society and the media is such that, as we saw, the Russian parliament voted unanimously for this. So there will not be any pushback, from the Russian elites. We have to see whether ultimately public discontent rises. And there too, of course, much will depend on what happens on the ground in Ukraine, because if the Russian army succeeds in beating off this Ukrainian offensive, then clearly that will, strengthen Putin. If they fail and Russia suffers another defeat, like the loss of Kherson or the loss of eastern Kharkiv last year, that would be a very bad blow for the Putin regime. We don't know what the consequences would be, but certainly it's something that Putin will do everything in his power to avoid or to reverse.
Anatol, just briefly going back to the leaks, there were a lot of speculations as to where they could be coming from, and just now Pentagon promised to turn every stone around to find out where those leaks originated from. And we're also talking about these leaks being compared to the WikiLeaks issue. From those isolated, I guess, pieces of information that we've been hearing, can we speculate at all as to who might have benefited from those leaks, who suffered the most, and who it might actually be? Could it be, in other words, could it be a non-state actor, somebody who doesn't belong to any secret services, intelligence? How are we seeing this?
Well, of course, there must be suspicion that the Russian Secret Service did it. Although it's worth pointing out that one aspect of the leaks was very embarrassing for Russia, and that was the degree to which the United States had managed to penetrate, Russian information and communications. Clearly, that will be very, very embarrassing for some elements in the Russian establishment, which casts some doubt on whether it was Russia. We know where the leaks first appeared. It was, of all places, on an online wargaming chat site. We don't know who put them there, but if, in fact, it was put, just by war game players, that is I mean, in a way, not surprising. I mean, I suppose the idea that extremely intelligent teenagers can run rings around security bureaucrats. Well, I know that my children can run rings around me, and anything to do with, with IT technology. But it would be I mean, if that was true, it would perhaps be a very striking, index of the sheer permeability and openness now of so much of this information. But I think so far the answer is that, as you say, this is speculation. We can't really say. Obviously, the biggest losers by far, it's the United States itself, because not just because of what the leaks reveal, but because the leaks themselves are a very serious embarrassment, which undermines faith in American security. But as far as wider embarrassment is concerned, it's well, there are a lot of people who have suffered from these leaks.
Anatol, what you mentioned about Russian intelligence and secret services, we indeed learned that it seems like the United States intelligence is getting almost everyday updates as to what the plans are of those secret agencies in Russia. Do you think it will somehow affect their standing with President Putin, and will there be a big scandal or a big, I don't know, reformatting of how they work?
Maybe to some extent, very much in private. But frankly, if Putin has not got rid of the top people, Defense Minister Shoigu, General Gerasimov, who, bore personal responsibility for the disaster of the Russian army at the start of this war, and simply for the corruption and lack of preparation of the Russian army over the past decade, then he's going to stick to his old tradition of sticking by his friends and supporters in a crisis. So I think the answer is no. Another question, though, is something that came out from the leaks is the extent to which American satellite intelligence and the deployment of new US satellite technology has really helped the Ukrainian side. And it has been suggested that if Russia were seriously to escalate against the West, it might begin by attacking US satellites, which of course would deal a very serious blow to US intelligence and to the Ukrainians, but it wouldn't kill any Westerner. And so it would not be at all the same thing as using tactical nuclear weapons or bombarding Poland. And I think that perhaps this leak may strengthen that possibility a bit, though of course I very much hope that it does not happen.